So for Lewis, the modern Western obsession with innovation is a sign of human restlessness, a sign that nothing that is created or finite is really able to satisfy us, which raises the question, what is there that really can satisfy? And for Lewis, of course, the answer is the Christian faith, and that is written down in many forms. And by looking at those, for example, in Augustine, in New Testament, in Thomas Aquinas, in Dante, in Lewis even, you find there's something that satisfies and makes you say, that is what it's all about.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Practical Wisdom. My name is Samuel Maruska, and today I'd like to talk about C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. He was a wartime apologist, a literary critic, and an acclaimed author. Today we're going to discuss about the main ideas and themes of C.S. Lewis, and I'm very happy to be joined today by Professor Alister McGrath. Hello, welcome to Practical Wisdom.
It's very good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Alister McGrath is a professor of science and religion at Oxford University. He's a prolific author. He has 3 doctorates from Oxford University and has debated famous atheists like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. He wrote numerous books, and these were published in several languages, and I'm just going to mention a few. Mere Apologetics, Narrative Apologetics. He wrote about the Reformation thought. He also wrote a book of memoirs called Through a Glass Darkly. He also wrote on atheism, The Twilight of Atheism, and he wrote a bestseller, The Dawkins Delusion. Also, he is a popular speaker and international speaker. And I'm very glad to be joined today by one of the world's experts on C.S. Lewis. Alister, I'd like to begin our talk with this idea, this concept of hiddenness in C.S. Lewis. In 1924, nearly 100 years ago, C.S. Lewis came across this book about space, time, and deity. Now, this book talked about consciousness, and C.S. Lewis wasn't very happy with the ideas that he found about consciousness in this book, and developed a threefold system of going about consciousness. He also talked about how many people think that it's only the things that we see that are important in our lives. But he is of the opinion that there are things that can't be seen. The things that are not seen are actually more important and more meaningful and more significant to us. Now, would you be able to unpack this concept of hiddenness? Why is God hidden from us? And if he wants to reveal himself to us, why do we see this world through a glass darkly, to quote one of your books?
Well, I think this is a very important question, and certainly you're right that Lewis wrestled with this question, and in fact, in my view, he offers us some really helpful ways of beginning to think about this. I think one of the basic points we need to make is that the human capacity to see is limited. We very often see only what we are able to see, and we have no means of naturally expanding our vision. And for me, one of the most important things about Lewis is the way in which he talks so much about the need to be able to see properly and the role of the Christian faith in expanding our natural ability to see. And for Lewis, if you like, Christianity opens our eyes. And it's, if you like, it's a two-way process. Something happens to us. We are healed. We are renewed. We're able to see things better. But at the same time, God, if you like, lightens things up. There's a very famous quote towards the end of a lecture that Lewis gave here in Oxford in 1945, and the final line of this lecture is, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And you have this idea of a sun rising, illuminating the landscape, so we can see what otherwise could not be seen because it's shadow. And that's a very important theme for Lewis. We are healed so we can see, and God illuminates things so we're able to see them even better. So for Lewis, this was a major theme in his thinking right throughout his life, I think.
Now, as we know, C.S. Lewis was an atheist who became Christian. And you do talk in your book about his conversion that's described in Surprised by Joy. Now, you also say that you think that the date of the conversion, his conversion, is slightly different than what we find in Surprised by Joy, and you argue that it's actually taken in place in 1930. Now, how does an atheist become a Christian, and what is the journey that Lewis went on from being an atheist to being a reluctant convert? So first of all, to believing that God exists, and then secondly, because this is a second event in his life, wasn't it, to becoming a Christian and believing in Jesus Christ?
I think that's a very important question. In my biography of Lewis, I published a picture of Lewis taken in 1917. He was a student here at Oxford, and I often wonder, looking at that picture, what was going through Lewis's mind. He was basically about to be sent to fight in the First World War, and it was very unlikely he would come back alive. And I often wonder if Lewis ever thought, while that photograph was being taken, I will one day be one of the world's best-known Christian apologists. Of course he didn't. He was an atheist. He thought he was going to die in the next 6 months. But I think that's very important, because Lewis did not expect and did not want to become a Christian. He was very happy. He did not like the idea of God. He talked about God as the great interferer, someone who kind of way gets in the way, stops you being who you're really meant to be. And Lewis, I think, initially really regarded Christianity as being simply completely out of date. But the outbreak of the First World War, in which Lewis fought, I think solidified this. You know, basically his argument was, look, if there is a God, and if this God is good, then there won't be a war, because God can stop that sort of thing. And so Lewis saw the First World War as a reason for giving added substance to his atheism. Now that's a very important point, because Lewis, when he returned to England after the First World War and became here a student at Oxford University, began to realize that if there is no God, then the First World War still happened. So you can't blame it on God, you have to blame it on human beings. And Lewis began to realize that actually atheism was not quite as intellectually compelling as he had once thought. And in the 1920s, as Lewis began his academic career here in Oxford, you begin to see him reflecting, maybe if there was a God, that would make more sense of things. It's not a very committed thought, it's an exploratory thought. And then, as he describes in Surprised by Joy, we see this process of recalibration of his way of seeing the world, rethinking things, and gradually beginning to realize that actually it was not simply that there was a God, but this was something intellectually compelling. And therefore, in the end, Lewis gives up his fight against God and admits that there is a God, and describes himself as the most reluctant convert in all of Christendom. It's a beautiful piece of narrative. But the key point is that Lewis, in effect, became a Christian because he felt compelled to do so by the force of the evidence. It was not something he wanted to do, it was something he had to do. And part of the reason is this intellectual realization, this is the best way of making sense of things.
He was very good friends with, as we know, with many people from the Inklings, in particular Tolkien. Now, what part did Tolkien play? Did he play any role in convincing Lewis of this bigger narrative that there is another intellectual world stimulating as well that you can live in and also live a meaningful life? What was his influence on C.S. Lewis?
Well, this is a very interesting question. Tolkien, as far as I can see, played no role in Lewis's rediscovery of God. But Tolkien played a very significant role in moving Lewis from, if you like, a generic belief in God to a specifically Christian way of thinking. And this happened here in Oxford in 1931. Something happened. Lewis basically began to realize that there was more to Christianity than simply believing in God. And in a very famous conversation with Tolkien in Magdalen College Gardens, they began to explore the role of myth. Now, by myth, Tolkien and Lewis both meant a story that's able to capture the imagination, but also convey intellectual content. And what Lewis could not see is how Christ, who lived 2,000 years ago, could be relevant to him today. And Tolkien's answer was that Christianity tells a story. And Christ plays a very significant part in that story. And you and I are part of that story today. And we re-narrate, we retell that story in our outreach and our mission. And Lewis suddenly began to realize that that made so much sense. It meant that Christianity appealed to his imagination. It was all about a story being told that captured the imagination and made sense of things. And I think that that conversation with Tolkien not simply helped Lewis to see what Christianity really was, but also helped Lewis to see how his native interest in telling stories could really be important apologetically. And that is one of the most distinctive things about Lewis as a Christian writer.
I think that's a very significant point in that Tolkien talked about myth in the literary sense with C.S. Lewis, and the fact that Christianity is a true myth. And you talked about their conversation in Oxford on Addison Walk, and after that conversation, you mentioned in your book C.S. Lewis Alive, you mentioned that C.S. Lewis wrote a letter to Greaves, and I quote, this is what he said: "I've just passed on from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ, in Christianity. I will try to explain this another time. My long night talk with Dyson and Tolkien had a good deal to do with it." And then you go on and you say the issue was not primarily about truth, but about meaning. So I think that this is a very, very important point in his understanding of Jesus Christ. Can I also ask you about people in churches today, Christians nowadays? Some Christians were born in a Christian family and don't experience the same radical change that C.S. Lewis experienced from an atheist to believing in Jesus Christ. Now, many of these people might have doubts about their salvation and about Jesus, about God, and about our world. Now, what would C.S. Lewis say to people who have had a different type of change in their lives?
I think Lewis speaks very powerfully to people who are not Christians and helps them to catch a vision of what Christianity is all about. So Lewis is very important in, I think, bringing people to faith. But one of Lewis's most interesting roles, in my view, is helping those who already would describe themselves as Christians go much deeper and further into their faith and discover what it is fully all about. Now, Lewis, I think, particularly during his period as professor at Cambridge University, began to refocus his outreach. He began to say, I am now going to talk mainly to those who already believe and help them to believe more firmly, more strongly, more richly. And he wrote books like, for example, The Four Loves, which actually are really intended to help Christians go deeper and discover something that would really bring their faith to life. So Lewis is unusual. He doesn't just speak to those who are outside Christianity and help them to discover what Christianity is all about. He also helps those who know Christianity, perhaps from their culture, or have discovered Christianity, but want to go deeper. And Lewis helps both of those groups of people. And I think that the reason why he's so effective at this is Lewis was an atheist who became a Christian and knew why he became a Christian, so he can speak to atheists. But he also grew in his faith, and he knew what helped him to grow. And he was able to speak to ordinary Christians, say, let me help you move further on in your faith. And for me, that's one of the reasons why Lewis is such an important writer. He speaks to two different audiences very effectively and very well.
That's a very interesting point, the fact that he speaks to and he's relevant to two different audiences. Now, you mentioned myth. I'd like to explore this idea of myth a little bit. I'd like to know, what is the difference, in your opinion, between a myth, a legend, and a folk tale? And how did C.S. Lewis reconcile his ideas on myth with pagan myths And in his understanding of myth, did Bultmann play any role in it? Bultmann had this theory of the demythologization of the New Testament. Did this play any role in shaping Lewis's understanding of the true myth?
I think Lewis's interaction with Bultmann is very interesting. To begin with, I think what we need to say is that Lewis, once he saw this idea that Christianity told a story which made sense of things and which actually involved each of us, that I think opened the way to some very exciting developments. For example, one of the things that Lewis helps us to think about is almost as if faith is about stepping into a story and becoming part of it. I think that's a very important idea because it in effect allows us to see how Lewis is saying we don't just believe, we actively engage something. And I think it's quite an interesting point. But certainly Lewis is quite clear. Here is something called Christianity, which may look like a myth. It has the form of a myth, but it is a true myth in that it really happened, and in that it is able to make sense of every other story that we tell. So if you like, it's a master narrative. It's something which, in fact, if it's right, explains everything. And that's a very important point. And what Lewis was saying is that Christianity takes the form of a narrative, a myth, and by engaging this, we're able to, in fact, understand what it says. Bultmann said, well, it's a myth in two senses. Number one, it's hopelessly out of date. And number two, I mean, who needs stories? We need ideas. And therefore you demythologize, both in the sense of moving from the past to the present and also getting rid of the narrative and discovering the ideas that lie behind that narrative. Lewis said you can't do that. The reason we do not demythologize is that we cannot demythologize because the narrative is part of the story. You can't just remove it because the story is integral to this. So Bultmann in effect thought a story was simply accidental or incidental. Lewis is saying, no, this is how Christianity is. It's a story which we can understand, but it's always going to be a story. If we convert to something else, we lose sight of what it really is. And Lewis, in my view, was one of the most perceptive critics of Bultmann on that specific point.
If we bring this into our contemporary context, now, there are myths in our culture today as well, and we have movies and we have theatre plays and we have other means by which we get into contact with modern myths. Is there any truth or spiritual truth in these modern myths that you may find in movies, for instance, or in other contexts? And do you think that Christians should use these to engage with other people?
I think Christians can use these critically, but they need to be aware that, in effect, they are going to use these as a sort of point of entry for talking about Christianity. And in doing that, they're not really endorsing these existing secular myths. They're more saying we can take these and use these as a gateway into a Christian understanding of things. For example, if we take a modern movie like The Matrix is basically a reworking of a classic myth from Plato, the idea of the underground cave in which we are trapped and we think the shadows are the true reality. And Lewis actually takes that myth and uses it, for example, in The Silver Chair, to try and make the point that helps us think about this in a Christian way. Because for a Christian, we are in a world of shadows, and there is a bigger and better world beyond it, but we think this is all that there is. And therefore what we can do is see how Christianity helps us to understand why we are deluded in this way, but also how we can discover and enter this real world. So Lewis, I think, would say something like this: the stories we tell, including modern myths, are significant. We're trying to make sense of things. Christianity tells a better story. It's a wonderful idea. It's a story that's able to make sense of other people's stories and say, well, that's interesting, but here's where what you're saying really takes us. And Christianity, in effect, is going to be the final goal, but you don't realize that yet. What I'm going to do is use your way of thinking as a gateway and show you that when you travel that road, you end up believing in God. So if you like, it's all about redirecting, repurposing myths our culture tells, confident that Christianity tells a better story that's able to make sense of all other stories and show them what they really are pointing to.
You mentioned Plato there and the cave story, and C.S. Lewis also makes other points in Mere Christianity. There's one that he makes about chronological snobbery. What is chronological snobbery in C.S. Lewis, and also is that relevant for us today?
I think it is a very relevant idea. For Lewis, chronological snobbery is simply the idea, old ideas, they're defunct, they're useless. The most recent is the best. In other words, innovation, novelty, that's what we need. And Lewis is saying, no, what we need to realize is there is wisdom in the past. What is new today will be out of date tomorrow. It's ephemeral. It's not permanent. It's not stable. And what Lewis is saying is, let's rediscover the classics, because in many ways they're able to say, here is something that's been tried and tested and still speaks to us today. For example, Plato, but more importantly, of course, the New Testament. And I think it's a very important point, because as I look at modern Western culture, I see this obsession with innovation. You have to have the most recent. And then you discover it doesn't satisfy us. You look for something even more recent, and there's this constant unsatisfied quest for what is the most recent, and it completely fails to satisfy you. Lewis is saying there are things that satisfy. People have found them, they've written about them, and by reading the rich wisdom of the past, for example, the New Testament, you are put in touch with something that is going to satisfy. So for Lewis, the modern Western obsession with innovation is a sign of human restlessness, a sign that nothing that is created or finite is really able to satisfy us, which raises the question, what is there that really can satisfy? And for Lewis, of course, the answer is the Christian faith, and that is written down in many forms. And by looking at those, for example, in Augustine, in the New Testament, in Thomas Aquinas, in Dante, in Lewis even, you find there's something that satisfies and makes you say, that is what it's all about.
So C.S. Lewis thinks that newer is not always better. And you mentioned Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and Dante. So you mentioned some medieval philosophers and authors. And we know that C.S. Lewis took inspiration from medieval literature, and he was also a literary critic and worked on that as well. Now, in your book, The Intellectual World of C.S. Lewis, you talk about the art of memory, ars memorativa. You also talk about imagination and building imaginative story. You talk about these two concepts, and you say that Surprised by Joy should be read in its context as an autobiography, as a biography, in the same way you would read Augustine's Confessions, for instance. So what role does the art of memory play in C.S. Lewis, and also imagination?
I think whether we look at Augustine with his Confessions or with C.S. Lewis, Surprised by Joy, what we see is the recollection of a life which has led from unbelief to God, and the realization that this process of recollection actually enables you to realize what it is about Christianity that really spoke to you, that changed you, and hence is something you can pass on to others. So if you like, Lewis is telling his own story. If you like, it's the journey of a soul. But Lewis is implying anybody who accompanies me on this journey is going to end up, thinking very similar thoughts. If you like, it's almost like apologetics through a personal narration. And I find that very compelling because I like reading biographies, and very often I find myself entering into them and trying to imagine what this is like. And that's what Lewis is doing. He's saying, journey with me, see what I see, think what I think, and see if this makes as much sense to you as it did to me. So in many ways what Lewis is doing is rediscovering the art of memory, the art of narration apologetically. This is something that will connect with people, and your personal narrative of discovery of faith can be a vehicle for helping others to discover the same thing. Now that's important, because I know many people who would say, well, look, I'm not a very able philosopher, I can't really argue very well, but I can tell my story. And what Lewis is saying was, I've done that too, and let me encourage you to do that. Now, Lewis does a lot more than that, but one of the things he does so well is to tell his own story in the hope that this might help somebody else redirect their story.
I think you're putting your finger on something very important there, in that not all people are able to go into debates and be apologists and defend the Christian faith. But what we can do is to tell our own story. And that's very meaningful and powerful, as C.S. Lewis points out. Now, you also mentioned briefly that we have something in us, within us, that's longing for something eternal, for something outside of this world. And this is known as the argument from desire. Now, as we know, this is not an actual philosophical argument. It's simply an analogy, and this idea that we all have a deep longing in us that cannot be like a thirst, that cannot be quenched by anything in the real world. So it follows that there must be a God who is the only one outside of this world who's able to satisfy that. And I was surprised to see in your book that you even quoted Bertrand Russell saying the same, very similar things. So I quote, Russell said, "The center of me is always and eternally a terrible pain, a searching for something beyond what the world contains, something transfigured and infinite." What is this longing that C.S. Lewis talks about, and what does it mean for us? Where does it take us?
I think this is a very important point. Lewis here is almost using a theological framework. He's saying, look, we've been created by God to relate to God. And once you accept that framework, you can see immediately that if we do not relate to God, there's a sense of absence. There's an emptiness within us where there ought to be a presence. And so Lewis's argument is that we feel that absence even though we don't necessarily know what it is. And what Christianity does is to name that. It says, this is what this really is. And once you see that, you know what to do to make this come true. Now, the reason I quoted Bertrand Russell is, of course, he was a well-known atheist. But Lewis is saying this is a human experience. We all have this because we've all been made by God, whether we like it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not. And as a result, we feel this emptiness. And so for Lewis, one of the things that Christianity does is not simply give us a new vision of reality, a new way of understanding the world, but also it is about fulfilling this relational absence that we feel at the moment. In other words, we come home to God and we have this sense of fulfillment which otherwise we cannot have. And so for Lewis, this human experience of emptiness is a very important starting point for an apologist, because it's there. And you can talk about Christianity not so much as a set of ideas, but rather as fulfilling who we are, what we're meant to be. It's about, in effect, directly engaging this sense of emptiness that so many people have in their lives. And it names it, and it shows what it points to, and says, this can be changed. And I think what Lewis is doing there is giving us a very powerful apologetic tool, which speaks to people who might not be interested in arguments, but have this sense of, well, there has to be more than this, or a sense that I'm not really the person I ought to be, or a sense that there has to be more to life than what I have. And that, I think, is very significant. Not many other apologists do that, but it's part of Lewis's overall approach to Christian apologetics.
I think you're making a valid point there, that many people think that, they consider life and they think to themselves, there has to be something more to life than this. And this includes atheists, agnostics, and Christians as well. And Christians, although they have come to faith, many Christians still have doubts. And agnostics have doubts, atheists have doubts too. How does Lewis reconcile doubt and faith in his works?
Well, I think one of the points that Lewis is making is that we are finite creatures. And that means that we can never hope to understand things fully, to see things properly. So we're always, if you like, walking in the shadows. There's a very interesting letter that Lewis wrote, which dates from the Second World War, when in effect he's experiencing walking from his own office in Magdalen College to JRR Tolkien's home. And it's in the blackout. And he really struggles to find his way because there is no street lighting at all. He has to kind of feel his way. And for that, Lewis uses that as a metaphor for the human situation. We don't see with absolute clarity. We can't see things as they really are, but God, in effect, gives us, if you like, this illumination to be able to see things as they really are, reassuring us that there is a big picture even if you don't see it fully, and in effect saying you can walk in hope and faith. And I think that's very important for Lewis because he likes Dante. And Dante's central metaphor is that of the pilgrim who's walking on a long and complicated road which leads to paradise. Words that begin from a dark wood. I can't see my way. I'm lost. And for Lewis, Christianity is about taking somebody who's lost, leading them by the hand on a road they can't really see, but really is there. And you can take them and lead them home to God.
And Dante on that journey has a lot to say about pride, one of the cardinal sins. And C.S. Lewis has some very interesting ideas in Mere Christianity about pride. And if I may quote from Mere Christianity, what he says about pride is quite striking. He says, and I quote, "Well, now we've come to the center. According to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Does this seem too exaggerated? If so, think it over. I pointed out a moment ago that the more pride one had, the more one disliked pride in others. In fact, if you want to find out how proud you are, the easiest way is to ask yourself, how much do I dislike it when other people snub me or refuse to take any notice of me or shove their oar in or patronize me or show off? The point here is that each person's pride is in competition with everyone else's pride." Now, can we discuss the role of pride in C.S. Lewis's theology, and why does he view pride as the most destructive force?
Because it nearly destroyed him. We're going back to the 1940s, and Lewis was beginning to become very well known. Books like Screwtape Letters really began to make him famous. And Lewis found he couldn't cope with fame. It made him proud. And he began to take advice from people about this. But he realized that this was something he had not been prepared for, how you cope with fame. It made him proud. So he began to develop a whole series of strategies, practical wisdom, if you like, to stop himself being proud. And it saved him. You know, that's so important. It's a part of Lewis's life that's not talked about enough, but the quotation you've just read to us just shows how seriously he took this, that in effect pride could destroy you as a human being, and he managed to find a way of in effect dealing with this. And he's warning his readers, this may happen to you, be aware of this. So for Lewis, in effect, pride is about being taken over by something which you can't control, which in effect is like a constant appetite you can't satisfy, and it destroys you. And Lewis says you simply have to fight this off, and the best way of doing this is by, in effect, challenging it and rooting it out. That's what he had to do. And I think he did it very successfully, but unfortunately, he does not give us the details of how he did it, although I think we can see some hints at this in some of his letters, which date from around the time when he began to experience this as a real problem. One of them is a very important point, and that is simply to refuse to see yourself as successful. Just in effect say, I don't care, I'm just me. And I think that's very important, in effect just breaking this cycle of addiction to fame, to pride, which if you don't, it will overwhelm you.
Now this leads me to the problem of evil. which I think is one of the greatest problems facing Christians and Christianity in general. And I remember Viktor Frankl, in his book, he famously talked about the psychology of people in Auschwitz. And he talks about this person who had a nightmare and was struggling in his sleep. And he could see that this person was struggling and was having a nightmare in his sleep. And he thought to himself, I should wake him up. And then he said, hang on a second, I must not do that, because sleep was the only refuge that that person could take in. And if I wake him up, reality is much worse than his nightmare. So there are many people who struggle with that. And you also mention in your books, you also mention Dostoevsky in The Brother Karamazov, in which Ivan tells this story of a little child who accidentally hurts a dog. And as it happens, this dog belongs to a powerful general. And the general, what he does is he gets a pack of dogs to torture and kill this child in front of his mother, and forces the mother to watch the scene as a child dies. Now this is, there's a lot of injustice in this world, and Hannah Arendt talks about the banality of evil. So there's a lot of evil that's uncalled for, or that's seemingly uncaused. What is C.S. Lewis's response to the problem of evil?
Lewis, I think, changed his thinking on this over his career. In The Problem of Pain, which is an early work from 1940, he gives what is in effect an intellectual answer to this. It reminds us of our mortality. I think that's very important. And he says a bit more than that, but you almost have the impression here is somebody who's wrestling with an intellectual problem. When we go ahead 20 years later to Lewis experiencing the death of his wife, and writing that heart-rending book, in which he tries, it's a grief observed, in which he talks about how he felt as his wife died and how he responded to that. You have the impression that the arguments he used in The Problem of Pain don't really satisfy him anymore. I think what we see here is Lewis, in effect, saying, what I have to learn is not simply to make sense of this, but to cope with it. How do I cope with pain? How do I cope with suffering? And that's a slightly different question, but it's a very important question. And yet, what's interesting is that in both cases, Problem of Pain and Grief Observed, he keeps coming back to Christ. Christ did this so that I might cope with the problem of pain. And as I read the later Lewis, I see Lewis in effect saying, look, there isn't really an answer to this. We have to learn to live with it. But we live with this knowing that Christ has been through this world of suffering before us and bears us up as we journey on the same road of faith. I would say, I think actually one very important point here is that in recent scholarship there's been a growing recognition that what we call theodicy, an attempt to rationalize evil, is very much a product of the Enlightenment. I think nowadays we're saying, well, actually we can't fully make sense of this. It's almost like arrogance to assume we can. We've got to learn to live well in a suffering world. We need practical wisdom to be able to do this. And as I read early Christian writers, and Lewis has clearly read these people as well, what they are noted for is their ability to cope with suffering. Christianity is not so much about an explanation of why there is suffering. It's saying this helps you to cope with it and live well, live in a fulfilled life in a suffering world. Maybe that's something we need to rediscover.
So in a sense, when I ask why me, why does this happen to me, I'm basically asking the wrong question. We should try to cope with pain, with evil, and live this throughout the eyes of a creator. And C.S. Lewis has a very popular quote about this, and he said, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight one. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? and this is a very simple point that C.S. Lewis made, where do we have this idea of how the world ought to be like?
I think that's a very important point. And one answer we might give is this. Because we have a vision of heaven, of what the recreated world is going to be like. And in the light of that, we look at this world and say, this is not the way things ought to be. But Lewis makes the point in Mere Christianity, I think, very, very well, that Christianity does not just say you have to learn to live with a suffering world. It gives us a vision of the difference we can make to a suffering world. And we do this by trying to make it a better place. So if you like, Lewis is making the point that Christianity is not about the passive acceptance of suffering. It's about the motivation to be active and transform this world to the extent that we can. It's energizing.
So if I can ask, in terms of evil, are humans inherently evil? And what is the original sin, in your opinion?
Well, I think what the doctrine of original sin really is saying is that there is something within us, whether we like it or not, which means that we constantly find our attempts to be good people frustrated by something over which we don't seem to have total control. We want to do good, but something seems to drag us down and frustrate us and actually sometimes redirect us to doing other things, bad things instead. And Paul talks about that in the New Testament. It's a very important idea. That it's almost as if there's something in us by virtue of being human beings which completely frustrates our attempts to be good people. And so what can be done about this? And Lewis, following Paul, says, we can't do anything about it, but God can do something. It's like being healed. I think that's a very powerful metaphor for what Christianity is all about. We learn that we are ill, and we learn we cannot heal ourselves, but there is the hope of healing through Christ. And it's not an instantaneous act of becoming a better person. It's rather about a gradual transformation over time. To use an analogy Augustine of Hippo uses, it's like someone who's in a hospital gradually becoming better, but not being better yet. In other words, there's this process of transformation initiated, and that's very important. But it does mean that Christianity finds itself in tension with those who say, we are all good, we can make this world a better place. Part of me looks at our world and say, well, what I'm seeing doesn't suggest that we are doing this very well. I think that we need to be absolutely realistic that actually, as G.K. Chesterton pointed out, that original sin makes an awful lot of sense of the way the world is working right now.
Absolutely, and Chesterton also said that the center and focus of human life is joy and not pain and suffering, which is an inevitable part of life. Now, in your book, Through a Glass Darkly, you talk about how you came to write The Dawkins Delusion. And you say that you were asked to write a rebuttal to one of his previous books some 20 years prior. And at that time, you said you didn't want to address that, and you didn't want to write a book in response to Dawkins' book, because you said there are other able theologians who might as well do that, or more capable than me to do that, and it was just not the right time for me to do so. And then when the God Delusion came out, you wrote a book in response to that, The Dawkins Delusion. Now, I want to ask you, this is how you chose to engage with the culture in which we live. And Christians ask themselves, how should I engage with atheists and with a secular society? Now, when do I engage with it? And there are obviously many books in other countries similar to what the Four Horsemen of Atheism publish and advocate. And some of them ask themselves, should I respond to this? Or they might find some Facebook posts, for instance, or they might find content on social media. And some of it is, as you say, as you rightly point out in many of your books, is quite radical.
I think this is a very important question. I think that one of the points that Lewis would make is simply that very often the aggressiveness with which atheism is presented, the ridicule, the contempt, the vilification that we see in the tone of their writings, is actually a really deep symptom of the problems with their own views. What I'm trying to make is that if you read Richard Dawkins or indeed Sam Harris, you have this sense of, I'm right and you're wrong. It's all about sloganization. It's about, in effect, intellectual ridicule. And the reason for that is they want to use rhetoric because the intellectual substance of their position is deeply vulnerable. They want to disguise that. And I think we have to realize that the aggressiveness is a symptom of weakness. The only way they can, in effect, defend themselves is by being so aggressive. They're hoping that they will frighten you off with their rhetoric. I think what you do is you say, I'm going to be like C.S. Lewis. I'm going to be reasonable. I'm going to be calm. I'm going to be intelligent. And people will listen. Because very often nowadays people are just appalled by the aggressiveness of what they call atheist fundamentalism. And they're saying there has to be something better than this. And your role is to say there is something better. I'm going to tell you what it is. And these people may try and shut me down, but I'm going to tell you what it is anyway. Because it stood the test of time. It'll be here tomorrow as it was yesterday. And they won't be here tomorrow because New Atheism already is out of favor and out of touch. And that's so important. When the New Atheism arrived, it was presented as the future. This is, in effect, a turning point in the history of humanity. No, it's just a new addition to ephemeral cultural trends which have now been superseded. And I think what we need to say is what Lewis said. You know, Christianity has survived precisely because it says something significant and important and enduring. And our job is to make sure people understand that and also are given a gateway to understanding what this is all about. And each of us can be that gateway.
This leads me to one of my last questions. How was C.S. Lewis received in other cultures and in other countries? It seems to me that if you go to Eastern Europe or Russia, which are mainly Orthodox countries, C.S. Lewis is not very well known. Whereas in America, in the United States, he became famous after the Screwtape Letters, and in the UK, indeed, he became very well known after he published The Problem of Pain in the 1940s, and of course with BBC talks that he gave during the war. How was he received in other cultures outside of the UK, and is he known in Muslim cultures at all?
I don't know about Muslim cultures, I'm afraid. But 10 years ago, I was asked to go to Lithuania and talk to the Lithuanian Parliament about how to teach science of religion, and I gave some lectures in the university. While I was there, I was there for 2 days, my host said to me, would you mind giving a public lecture on C.S. Lewis? And it was arranged at very short notice. We had a live translation. We went to the cathedral in the centre of Vilnius. It was packed out. And I talked about C.S. Lewis, why he was so important, to this huge crowd, mainly of older people. And afterwards I was told, these people, they explained this to me, these people had put up with suppression of their faith during the Soviet era. And the person who kept them going was C.S. Lewis, who they read in pirated Russian translations. And they want to say, this is the man who kept us going. So I think that answers your question. Lewis actually had a lot of influence on other people. And I think we're only just beginning to discover how widely he was read and how important he was to people, often during very dark times.
As we close, atheists generally think that religion is a source of evil in this world. And religion is the source of many wars, of many injustices in the world. And we should simply get rid of religion and eventually, although many have predicted this 50, 70 years ago, but we still hear that eventually when religion dies out and when science replaces God, we will all live in a better world, in a much objective, morally objective world in which everyone will be happier. Now, can I ask you, as we close, what will the world look like? And what would our culture look like with no religion, if there wasn't religion at all?
If you get rid of religion, then different religions will simply re-emerge. And the key point is that actually everyone knows attempts to suppress religion simply lead to its resurgence or its regeneration in different forms. John Gray's book, 7 Types of Atheism, is a very important work. And one of the points he makes is this. What he calls God surrogates and alternatives to God, like Richard Dawkins, are simply in denial about the violence of the atheist past. And all they're doing is simply arguing to suppress one aspect of human culture in the belief that this will totally redirect human culture. It won't. And his argument is very simply, atheism needs to wake up to the realization that religion isn't a problem, it's just the way people think. And what they need to do is actually engage with it more intelligently. And I look forward to that.
Alister, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. We need practical wisdom today. By that I mean not just something intellectual that makes us think in a different way. We need something that helps us to live better, to be able to cope with life more fully. And that's why I'm very happy to endorse this podcast. We need practical wisdom. C.S. Lewis provides it, so do others. We need it.